The 100-year-old veteran's fork clattered to the floor, his arthritic hands too weak to hold it steady. Can't even eat properly. Maybe you should try the nursing home across the street, the manager said loudly, pointing at the exit while other diners turned to stare. The veteran's chin trembled as he bent down slowly, apologizing under his breath. But the manager crossed his arms and tapped his watch. A woman 2 tables over stood up, her face pale, staring at the old man's worn military cap. She didn't move toward him yet, just stood there frozen, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that hadn't fallen. The manager raised his voice again, impatient now. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disrupting other customers." The old man's fingers finally closed around the fork. He tried to straighten up, but his back wouldn't cooperate. He stayed bent over, one hand on the floor, the other clutching the fork, his breathing labored and wet. His name was James Edward Holland, and he was exactly 100 years old. He'd been born in a farmhouse outside Lexington, Kentucky, in September of 1924. His mother had delivered him herself with only his grandmother present, the doctor 12 miles away, and the roads too muddy to pass. He'd grown up during the Depression, learned to work a field before he could write his own name, watched his father's hands crack and bleed from dawn to dusk labor that barely kept them fed. They'd had a small tobacco farm, 23 acres, most of it clay and rocks. James had 3 younger sisters. He was the one who'd had to quit school at 14 to work full-time when his father's back gave out. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, James was 17. He'd been in the barn mending a broken plow when his mother came running out, her face streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she told him. His father had looked at him across the dinner table that night and said just 4 words, "You'll have to go." James had nodded. He understood. His sisters needed to eat. The farm needed to survive. And the country needed him. He'd enlisted the day he turned 18. January 1943. He'd lied about his weight because he was only 132 pounds, too light by Army standards. But the recruiter had looked the other way. They needed bodies. James became one of them. He'd served in the 101st Airborne Division. He'd jumped into Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, just after midnight. His parachute tangled in tree branches. German fire lighting up the darkness like lightning. He'd cut himself down and fought for 37 straight days. He'd jumped into Holland during Operation Market Garden. He'd been at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, dug into a frozen foxhole with 3 other men, all of them sure they'd die there in the snow. One of them had. James still remembered his name. Curtis Pemberton, age 19. From Nebraska, James had survived the war. He'd come home in 1945 with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and shrapnel in his left leg that doctors said would work its way out eventually. It never did. He'd married a woman named Dorothy in 1947. She'd been a teacher at the elementary school. They'd had 2 sons. Raised them in a small house on the edge of town, same town where James had been born. He'd worked at the lumber mill for 41 years. Dorothy had died of cancer in 2003. Their older son had been killed in a car accident in 1989. Their younger son had moved to Arizona in 2007 and called maybe 3 times a year. James lived alone now in a senior apartment complex on the south side of Lexington. 1 room, a kitchenette, a bathroom he could barely navigate anymore. His legs didn't work like they used to. His hands shook constantly, the arthritis so bad some days he couldn't button his own shirt. He had a home health aide who came twice a week, a young woman from the Philippines named Maria, who was kind and patient and talked to him like he was a person, not a chore. Most days, James stayed in his apartment. He watched television, though his hearing was so bad, he had to turn the volume up to 90. He looked at old photographs and albums Dorothy had kept, her handwriting on the back of each picture, dates and names he could barely read anymore. He ate canned soup and crackers. He slept in his recliner because lying flat made his chest hurt. He was lonely in a way that felt like drowning, slow and constant and inevitable. But every Sunday, James did something for himself. He got dressed in his best clothes, khaki pants, a button-down shirt, a jacket with his military patches sewn on the shoulders, and he took a taxi to the Bluebird Diner on Main Street. It was a tradition he'd started after Dorothy died. Something to look forward to. Something to get out of bed for. He'd order the same thing every time: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and coffee. He'd sit in the same booth by the window. He'd eat slowly, carefully, and watch people walk by outside. For 1 hour a week, he didn't feel quite so alone. He'd been going to the Bluebird for 17 years. But 3 months ago, the diner had closed. The owner had retired, sold the building. James had been devastated. He'd tried other places, but nothing felt right. They were too loud, too fast, too modern. He didn't understand the menus. The servers didn't have patience for how long it took him to decide, to eat, to count out his money. Last Sunday, Maria had suggested a new place, Martin's Family Restaurant. She'd heard it was quiet, reasonably priced, good comfort food. James had been hesitant, but she'd insisted. She'd even called a taxi for him, made sure he had enough cash in his wallet, reminded him to bring his veteran's ID in case they offered a discount. Martin's Family Restaurant was in a strip mall on the east side of town, between a dollar store and a laundromat. The building was generic, beige siding, and a neon sign. Inside, it was trying too hard to be homey. Checkered tablecloths, fake flowers in plastic vases, photographs of farms and barns on the walls. It was a Sunday afternoon, just after 2 o'clock. The lunch rush was over. There were maybe 8 other people in the restaurant, scattered across the dining room. James had walked in slowly, his cane tapping against the tile floor. A young hostess, maybe 19 with her hair in a ponytail, had greeted him with a smile. "Just one?" "Yes, please." She'd led him to a booth near the middle of the restaurant. James had eased himself down, the process taking nearly a minute, his joints protesting. The hostess had handed him a menu and a glass of water. "Your server will be right with you." James had looked at the menu. The print was small, the lighting dim. He'd squinted, tilted the menu toward the window, tried to make out the words. After a few minutes, a waiter appeared. He was in his mid-20s, wearing a black apron, his hair slicked back, his expression already annoyed. "What can I get you?" James looked up. "Do you have meatloaf?" The waiter glanced at the menu in James's hands. "It's on there." "I'm having trouble reading it. The print is small." The waiter sighed, audibly. "Meatloaf is $12.95. Comes with 2 sides." "What sides do you have?" The waiter rattled off a list so fast James couldn't follow. "Could you say that again, please? A little slower?" The waiter's jaw tightened. He repeated the list, barely slower. James caught maybe half of it. "Mashed potatoes and green beans, please." "Anything to drink?" "Coffee." The waiter took the menu and walked away without another word. James sat there, his hands folded on the table, trying to ignore the looks from the other diners. He knew he was slow. He knew he was a bother. But he just wanted a meal. One meal in a restaurant, like a normal person. The food arrived 15 minutes later. The waiter set the plate down hard enough that the fork bounced off the edge and clattered to the floor. James looked down at it, then at the waiter. I'm sorry. Could I have another fork, please? The waiter's expression was pure irritation. He didn't say anything, just turned and walked away. James waited. 5 minutes passed. The waiter didn't return. James looked around, trying to catch someone's eye, but no one was paying attention. His food was getting cold. Finally, he decided to pick up the fork himself. He couldn't reach it without getting down, so he slid out of the booth slowly, his movements stiff and painful. He got to his knees, his joints screaming, and reached for the fork. That's when a voice cut through the restaurant. "What are you doing?" James looked up. A man in his 40s, wearing a button-down shirt with the restaurant's logo embroidered on the chest, was standing a few feet away. The manager. His arms were crossed, his expression somewhere between annoyed and disgusted. James's voice was quiet. "I dropped my fork. You can't be on the floor. That's a health code violation." "I'm sorry, I just needed..." "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to get up and return to your seat." James tried to stand. He got one foot under him, then the other, but his legs wouldn't hold. He wobbled, nearly fell. The manager didn't move to help him. James finally managed to pull himself up using the edge of the booth. His face was hot with shame. He sat back down, breathing hard. "I'm sorry. I dropped my fork. The waiter didn't bring me another one." The manager's voice was loud. Loud enough that every person in the restaurant was now watching. "Maybe if you could eat properly, we wouldn't have this problem." He pointed toward the door. "There's a nursing home across the street. Maybe you'd be more comfortable there." James's chin trembled. He looked down at his hands, at the way they shook no matter how hard he tried to steady them. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble." The manager crossed his arms and tapped his watch. "Sir, you're disrupting other customers. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." James bent down again, slower this time, his back screaming. His fingers closed around the fork. He tried to straighten up, but his back wouldn't cooperate. He stayed bent over, one hand on the floor, the other clutching the fork, his breathing labored and wet. He could feel eyes on him, judging, pitying, wishing he'd just disappear. Then a chair scraped. Footsteps. A woman's voice, shaking with emotion. "Stop, just stop." James looked up. A woman in her 30s was walking toward him. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, was wearing jeans and a sweater, her face pale and her eyes red. She stopped a few feet from the manager, staring at James like she'd seen a ghost. Her hand was over her mouth. When she spoke again, her voice cracked. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" The manager looked at her, annoyed. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "It absolutely concerns me." She turned to James, her eyes filling with tears. "Sir, what's your name?" James's voice was hoarse. "James Holland." The woman's breath caught. "James Edward Holland? 101st Airborne?" James blinked. "Yes." "How did you..." The woman pointed at his jacket, at the patches on the shoulders. "I'm a history teacher at the high school. We just had a World War II veteran come speak to my students last month. He talked about the 101st. He talked about D-Day. He mentioned a James Holland who'd saved his life in Normandy." Her voice was barely steady. "Was that you?" James's eyes were distant, like he was looking at something no one else could see. "I don't know. Maybe. A lot happened that day." The woman turned to the manager, her voice rising. "This man is a D-Day veteran. Do you understand what that means? He jumped out of an airplane into enemy fire when he was 19 years old. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He's 100 years old, and he just wanted to eat a meal in peace, and you're humiliating him." The manager's face flushed. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." She looked around the restaurant at the other diners. "Did any of you know?" She pointed at James. "This man is the reason we're sitting here right now, safe and free, eating our lunch without worrying about bombs or invasions. And you're all just sitting there watching him be treated like garbage." An older man at a corner table stood up. He was maybe 70, with a military haircut and a back that was still straight. "I'm a veteran. Vietnam. And she's right. This is disgraceful." He walked over to James, held out his hand. "Sir, it would be my honor to help you." James took his hand, and the man helped him back into the booth, gentle and careful. The woman picked up the fork from the floor and handed it to the waiter, who was standing nearby looking pale. "Get him a clean fork, and his meal should be free. And if you have a problem with that, I'll pay for it myself." The waiter nodded quickly and disappeared into the kitchen. The manager opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but the woman cut him off. "I'm going to be writing a review about this, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows how you treated a World War II veteran." She looked at James, her voice softening. "Sir, I'm so sorry. You deserved better." James's eyes were wet. "Thank you." The woman sat down across from him in the booth. "Can I sit with you? I'd love to hear about your service, if you're willing to talk about it." James nodded, his voice thick. "I'd like that." Over the next hour, James told her stories. About the jump into Normandy, about the friends he'd lost, about the cold at Bastogne, so cold they'd burned their own socks for warmth. About coming home and trying to forget, trying to be normal, trying to build a life. The woman listened to every word, asking questions, taking notes on her phone. She told him she wanted to bring him to her school, to have him speak to her students. James said he'd think about it. Other diners approached. The Vietnam veteran bought James's meal. A woman in her 60s thanked him for his service, tears in her eyes. A young couple with a baby asked if they could take a photo with him. James was overwhelmed, embarrassed by the attention, but also something else. He felt seen. After 17 years of invisibility, of being a burden, of being in the way, he felt like he mattered. The manager approached as James was finishing his meal. His face was red, his voice subdued. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I was out of line. Your meal is on the house, and I'd like to offer you a standing reservation here every Sunday, anytime you want, no charge." James looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want free meals. I just wanted to be treated like a person." The manager nodded, looking down at his feet. "I understand, and I'm sorry. It won't happen again." James finished his coffee. The woman, whose name was Sarah Brennan, gave him her phone number and email. She promised to call him during the week to set up a time for him to visit her school. The Vietnam veteran, whose name was Robert Chen, walked James outside and waited with him until his taxi arrived. Before James got in the car, Robert saluted him. James, surprised, returned the salute, his hand shaking but steady enough. The story didn't end there. Sarah Brennan wrote about what happened on social media that night. She didn't name the restaurant, but she described the incident and James's service in detail. The post went viral. Local news picked it up. By Tuesday, a reporter was calling James's apartment, asking for an interview. James agreed, hesitant but willing. The interview aired on Wednesday evening. James sat in his small apartment, his military jacket on, his hands folded in his lap, and talked about his service. He talked about D-Day, about the friends who didn't come home, about what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. He talked about Dorothy, about his sons, about the loneliness of being 100 years old. He talked about what happened at the restaurant, his voice steady but his eyes wet. The response was overwhelming. The local VFW contacted him, offered to help with anything he needed. A veterans organization set up a fund to help cover his expenses. Sarah's school invited him to speak, and when he did, 300 students filled the auditorium. They gave him a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. James stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges to keep them steady, and cried. The restaurant's corporate office issued a public apology. They announced new training for all staff on how to treat elderly customers and veterans with dignity. They didn't fire the manager, but they demoted him and required him to complete sensitivity training. The waiter quit before he could be disciplined. Years later, he'd say that day changed him, that he'd never forgotten the shame of it. But the most significant thing happened 3 weeks after the interview aired. James received a letter. It was from a man named Richard Novak, who lived in Pennsylvania. Richard was 82, a retired engineer. He wrote, "Mr. Holland, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Richard Novak. You saved my life on June 7, 1944, outside Sainte-Mère-Église. I was shot in the leg, trapped in a ditch, Germans closing in. You came back for me. You carried me a quarter mile to the aid station. I've spent 79 years trying to find you to say thank you. I saw you on the news, and I knew it was you. Same face, same voice, same man who gave me my life back." James read the letter 3 times. He couldn't remember Richard's face, couldn't remember carrying him. He remembered the ditch, remembered the sound of machine gun fire, remembered thinking everyone was going to die. But he'd blocked out so much of it, buried it so deep he couldn't reach it anymore. He called the number at the bottom of the letter. Richard answered on the second ring. They talked for 2 hours. Richard told him about his life, his wife of 57 years, his 3 children, his 6 grandchildren, his career designing bridges. He told James that none of it would have existed without him. James told Richard he was just doing his job. Richard said that didn't make it less important. They made plans to meet. Richard said he'd drive to Kentucky. James said he'd be waiting. They met on a Saturday afternoon in November. Sarah Brennan was there with a camera, documenting it for her students. Robert Chen was there too, along with several members of the local VFW. Richard walked into the restaurant, the same one where James had been humiliated, but which had now become a place that honored him. And when he saw James, he started crying. James stood up slowly, and they embraced. 2 old men who'd been young together in hell, who'd survived when so many hadn't. Richard stayed for a week. They spent hours together, looking at old photographs, sharing stories, filling in the blanks of memories that had faded. On his last day, Richard gave James a gift. It was a photograph, black and white and creased, of a group of young soldiers standing in front of a bombed-out building in France. James was in the front row, his face so young it was almost unrecognizable. Richard pointed to himself in the back, barely visible. "I kept this for 79 years. I want you to have it." James held the photograph with shaking hands. He stared at the faces, at the boys who'd become men too fast, at the ghosts he'd carried for 8 decades. His voice was barely a whisper. "I forgot what we looked like. We looked like kids. We were kids." James lived another 14 months after that day in the restaurant. He spent his 101st birthday surrounded by people. Sarah's students, Robert Chen and the VFW members, Maria, his home health aide, and Richard Novak, who flew in from Pennsylvania. He spoke at 3 more schools. He was interviewed by a documentary filmmaker working on a project about D-Day. He was honored at a Veterans Day ceremony where the mayor gave him a key to the city. But more than any of that, he wasn't lonely anymore. Sarah visited him every week. Robert checked in on him daily. Maria brought him home-cooked meals. His son in Arizona started calling more, eventually flew out to visit. The restaurant kept its promise. Every Sunday, James had his booth, his meatloaf, his coffee. And every Sunday, someone would stop by his table to shake his hand, to say thank you, to sit with him so he didn't have to eat alone. James Edward Holland died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in January. He was 101 years old. His funeral was standing room only. Veterans came from 3 states to honor him. Sarah's students attended in uniform, standing at attention. Richard Novak delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he talked about the boy who'd saved his life and the man who taught him what dignity looked like. They buried James with full military honors. 7 riflemen fired 3 volleys. A bugler played taps. The flag from his coffin was folded and presented to Richard, who accepted it with shaking hands and held it against his chest like it was the most precious thing he'd ever been given. Later, at the reception, Sarah stood up to speak. She talked about the day in the restaurant, about how close they'd all come to letting a hero die, invisible and alone. She talked about the importance of seeing people, really seeing them, not just glancing past them because they're old or slow or in the way. She talked about how one moment of standing up had changed everything, not just for James, but for her students, for the community, for everyone who'd heard his story. James spent his whole life being a good man, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. He fought for us when we weren't even born yet. He came home and worked hard and raised a family and never asked for recognition. And when the world forgot about him, when he became just another invisible old man, one moment of cruelty almost broke him. But it didn't. Because someone stood up. Because people remembered that before he was old, he was young. And before he was forgotten, he was a hero. And he always, always deserved better than what that manager tried to give him. The manager was there, in the back of the room. He'd asked to come, to pay his respects. When the reception ended, he approached Sarah. "I think about that day every single day," he said. "What I did to him, what I almost cost him." Sarah looked at him. "Then make sure it means something. Make sure you never treat anyone that way again. Make sure his story changes you." The manager nodded. "It has. I promise you, it has." Years later, Martin's family restaurant would have a plaque on the wall near the booth where James always sat. It had his photograph, the young soldier in Normandy, and a simple inscription, "James Edward Holland, 1924-2025. D-Day veteran, American hero." He reminded us that every person has a story worth hearing. And every Sunday at 2 o'clock, that booth was reserved, not for anyone in particular, but for anyone who needed it, anyone who was alone, anyone who was elderly or struggling or forgotten. The staff had instructions to treat whoever sat there with the utmost respect and dignity, to take their time, to listen, to remember that everyone, no matter how old or slow or seemingly insignificant, mattered. Because James Holland had taught them that, and they would never forget. Have you ever watched someone who sacrificed everything get treated like they're worthless? It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder what kind of world we're building. If this story got to you, drop a comment about a veteran or elderly person in your life who deserves more recognition than they get. And if you think more people need to hear this, share it. Because the James Hollands of the world are disappearing, and we owe them more than our silence.